Ladies and gentlemen, there are some people who enter your life as a chapter, but they leave as a warning. There are some hearts that do not know your value while you are standing in front of them, breathing for them, caring for them, hoping for them, sacrificing for them. They only understand your worth when the light in your eyes begins to fade from their world. They only understand your depth when the silence you leave behind starts echoing louder than all the words you once gave them. And that is the terrible beauty of human life. Sometimes you do not become a comfort in someone's memory. You become a lesson, a hard one, a deep one, a lesson that keeps returning in the quiet hours, in the lonely nights, in the moments when pride finally sleeps and truth wakes up. You became a lesson they can never forget. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me carefully. Not every loss is a punishment. Not every heartbreak is destruction. Not every ending is the end of your power. Sometimes life strips away what you thought you needed so it can reveal what you truly are. Sometimes the people who looked at you as ordinary are the very ones who will one day tremble under the weight of what they lost. They did not see the treasure when it was in their hands. They did not feel the value when your kindness was present. They mistook your patience for weakness, your loyalty for availability, your love for something that would remain forever. But the soul is not foolish forever. The heart can endure only so much neglect before it begins to awaken. And when it awakens, it is no longer asking to be understood. It is no longer begging to be chosen. It is no longer trying to prove its worth to those who were blind to it. It rises, it stands, it transforms. And in that transformation, you become unforgettable. Ladies and gentlemen, the human psyche is a strange and sacred place. We think we know ourselves, but often we are only seeing the surface. Beneath the surface lives the self that has been wounded, the self that has been ignored, the self that has been waiting in the shadows for the moment of revelation. Some people never change because they never descend into that inner chamber where truth is waiting. But others are shattered just enough to discover their real depth. And when they do, they are no longer the same person who once apologized for existing, no longer the same soul that once accepted crumbs and called them love, no longer the same heart that once begged to be seen. They become the one who knows. They become the one who has seen through illusion. They become the one who has lost innocence but gained vision. And that vision is terrifying to those who once underestimated them. There is a kind of power that does not shout. It does not announce itself with noise or with rage. It arrives quietly, like a winter wind that changes the temperature of a room before anyone notices. It lives in your presence when you no longer chase. It lives in your eyes when you no longer plead. It lives in your posture when you no longer bend to be accepted. It lives in your silence when you no longer rush to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. That silence is not emptiness. That silence is authority. And the people who once controlled your emotions begin to feel the loss of their control only when you stop offering them access to your soul. Then they start remembering you differently. Then they begin to replay the moments they dismissed. Then they begin to hear your name in the stillness. Then they begin to discover that what they thought was routine was actually grace. What they thought was easy was actually rare. What they thought was replaceable was actually irreplaceable. Ladies and gentlemen, some people only value a flame after the room goes dark. They only value your warmth after your absence turns the cold into an unbearable truth. They only understand your devotion once devotion is no longer available. They only understand your patience once patience has already left the room. And by then, it is too late to rebuild what they neglected. Because real value is not only about being loved, it is about being recognized while love is still alive. It is about being honored before distance becomes the teacher. It is about understanding that every heart, no matter how gentle, has a limit. Every soul, no matter how kind, has a threshold. Every person, no matter how forgiving, can eventually say enough. And that moment when enough becomes sacred is the beginning of your rebirth. You became a lesson because you were not meant to remain a silent sacrifice. You were not born to be used and then forgotten. You were not made to pour out your life into hands that never learned how to hold it. You were not created to be a convenient presence in someone's comfort zone and a painful absence when they needed the truth. No. You became a lesson because the universe, in its own mysterious way, was teaching the people around you something they refused to learn gently. It was teaching them that love without respect becomes humiliation. It was teaching them that attention without appreciation becomes waste. It was teaching them that presence is a privilege, not a guarantee. And when they lost you, they lost more than a person. They lost a reflection of their own failure. They lost the chance to be worthy of what was offered. They lost the opportunity to meet you with the maturity you deserved. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a wound that never appears on the skin but changes the entire architecture of the soul. It is the wound of being unseen while you are giving everything. It is the wound of being misunderstood while speaking from the heart. It is the wound of being underestimated by the very people you tried to love with sincerity. This kind of pain does not simply hurt, it educates. It educates the part of you that was too trusting. It educates the part of you that believed effort alone would create loyalty. It educates the part of you that thought all hearts were honest. And although the lesson arrives dressed in heartbreak, it carries a strange gift, discernment. Once you have been through the fire of disappointment, you no longer worship appearances. You no longer confuse intensity with depth. You no longer mistake pursuit for love. You begin to see. You begin to read people by their actions, not their promises. You begin to feel the truth beneath the performance. And that is when you stop being easy to deceive. There is a profound tragedy in being loved too late. Some people will only call you special when they can no longer reach you. Some will only admit your value when your absence has already become a fact. Some will only celebrate the essence of your soul when it is no longer within their grasp. But the soul cannot be resurrected by regret alone. The silence after your departure does not exist to punish them. It exists to reveal them. It reveals who was sincere and who was comfortable. It reveals who was loyal and who was merely present. It reveals who truly saw you and who was entertained by your light without ever honoring its source. And that revelation is the lesson, not just for them, but for you. Because in losing them, you discover something essential. Your worth was never dependent on their recognition. Their blindness did not diminish your beauty. Their neglect did not diminish your depth. Their failure did not diminish your soul. You were always worthy. They were simply not ready. Ladies and gentlemen, a person who has truly suffered becomes impossible to fake. They no longer move through life with the careless innocence of someone who has never been tested. They carry a different energy, a quieter energy, a more precise energy. They have seen how quickly affection can turn into indifference. They have seen how easily promises can dissolve. They have seen how often people speak of love while practicing convenience. And because they have seen it, they are changed. They become less tolerant of performance and more loyal to truth. They become less impressed by words and more moved by consistency. They become less willing to shrink for the comfort of others. They become more aware that respect is not a luxury. It is a requirement. That awareness changes everything. It changes the way they walk, the way they speak, the way they choose, the way they love, and the way they leave. Some of the deepest lessons in life are not taught by teachers, but by betrayal. Betrayal is a brutal instructor. It does not arrive politely. It breaks in. It tears open illusions. It shows you who stands when your name is no longer useful. It shows you who remains when admiration is gone. It shows you who you were when you were trying too hard to be accepted. And although betrayal hurts, it can also initiate the birth of a stronger self. Because when the mask falls off from the world around you, your own inner face becomes clearer. You begin to ask important questions. Who am I when I am not being approved? Who am I when I am not being chosen? Who am I when I am not being chased? Who am I when the applause stops? And in answering those questions, you begin the sacred work of individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. You are no longer simply the reflection of others' expectations. You become yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in every wounded life when sadness turns into stillness, and stillness turns into strength. At first, you cry because you want them to understand. Then you cry because you wish they would return. Then one day you stop crying, not because the pain never existed, but because your soul has finally realized that some doors close so that you can stop living in the hallway. Some people leave so that you can stop begging to be enough for them. Some endings are mercy. Some silence is protection. Some loneliness is the beginning of wisdom. And once you understand that, you stop fighting the lesson and start learning from it. You became a lesson they can never forget because your existence exposed something in them they were unwilling to confront. Your loyalty exposed their inconsistency. Your sincerity exposed their superficiality. Your softness exposed their cruelty. Your patience exposed their impatience. Your depth exposed their shallowness. Your truth exposed their masks. And people do not easily forget the one who reveals them to themselves. They may laugh in the beginning. They may act indifferent. They may pretend they are untouched. But beneath the surface, the lesson keeps working. It keeps knocking. It keeps returning. It keeps asking the same question. What did you do with the person who would have loved you if you had known how to value them? Ladies and gentlemen, the soul does not forget its own injuries. Even when the mind tries to move on, the inner life keeps a record. It remembers the nights you were ignored. It remembers the words that cut deeper than blades. It remembers the waiting, the hoping, the self-abandonment, the times you swallowed your own truth just to keep peace in a room where peace had already died. But the soul also remembers its healing. It remembers the first time you chose yourself. It remembers the first time you stopped chasing. It remembers the first time you stood in your own dignity and said no more. That is the beginning of freedom, not the freedom to hate, but the freedom to no longer be bound, not the freedom to seek revenge, but the freedom to no longer need validation from those who could not see you. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the great mysteries of human life. The person who hurts you may think they are winning in the moment. They may think they are powerful because you are silent. They may think they are superior because you are wounded. They may think your kindness means you will always remain. But time has a way of turning the tables with a precision no human hand can imitate. Time is the patient judge. It reveals, it separates, it clarifies, and often, long after the injury, it brings the truth to the surface. Then the one who was ignored begins to flourish. The one who was dismissed begins to shine. The one who was treated as ordinary becomes extraordinary in their absence. And the one who once thought they had nothing to fear now lives with memory. Memory is a relentless guest. It visits at night. It revisits the past. It whispers what pride cannot erase. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that being forgotten is painful, but being remembered wrongly can be even more painful. Many people would rather erase the lesson than face its meaning, but the lesson remains. It remains in the shape of regret. It remains in the ache of comparison. It remains in the subtle loneliness that follows a missed opportunity. And although you may never witness their confession, you do not need it. The lesson has already been written into their lives. They will remember the way you listened when others would not. They will remember the way you gave when others only took. They will remember the way your presence softened the atmosphere and made life feel more alive. They will remember. Not always with words, but with feeling. Not always with apology, but with absence. Not always with courage, but with longing. Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time when the heart must stop asking, "Why did they not love me enough?" and start asking, "Why did I stay where I was not cherished?" That is a painful question, but it is a liberating one. It shifts the gaze from helplessness to awareness. It does not blame the wounded soul for being wounded. No. It simply teaches responsibility for the future. Because wisdom is not born from pretending nothing happened. Wisdom is born when you look at the wreckage and say, "Never again will I hand my soul to someone who treats it like a disposable thing. Never again will I confuse loneliness with destiny. Never again will I stay where my dignity has to beg for oxygen." That vow is not bitterness. That vow is self-respect. And self-respect changes your fate. It changes the kind of love you accept. It changes the people who can stay near you. It changes the conversations you tolerate. It changes the price you are willing to pay for being included. It changes your relationship with your own pain. Because once you begin to value yourself, you stop handing out access to those who are committed to misusing it. You become selective. You become clear. You become difficult to manipulate. You become impossible to cheapen. And the people who once expected you to remain the same begin to realize the old version of you is gone. The version that tolerated less than love is gone. The version that confused attention with devotion is gone. The version that over-explained and overgave and over-forgave is gone. In its place stands someone else, someone calmer, someone stronger, someone more exact. Someone who has already been through the fire and is no longer afraid of the heat. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to hear this not as comfort but as truth. Your pain is not proof that you were weak. Your pain is proof that you love deeply. And loving deeply in a shallow world is a dangerous thing. It makes you vulnerable to those who consume without understanding. It makes you open to those who take without gratitude. It makes you available to those who do not know what to do with authenticity. But that same depth, once tempered by suffering, becomes a source of immense power, because the one who has loved deeply and been disappointed deeply knows what is real. They know the difference between a performance and a presence. They know the difference between desire and devotion. They know the difference between being wanted and being valued. They know, and knowing is one of the rarest forms of freedom. Your lesson becomes unforgettable because it is not merely about you leaving, it is about what your leaving awakens in them. It awakens conscience, memory, regret, and a painful kind of self-recognition. It forces them to ask why they were blind. It forces them to confront the cost of their own immaturity. It forces them to admit that love is not endless when it is mistreated. It forces them to see that every action has a consequence, and every neglect has an echo. That echo may arrive later, but it arrives. It always arrives. The soul of every person who dismissed a true heart eventually sits alone with that absence. And in that silence, your lesson speaks louder than all their excuses. Ladies and gentlemen, do not underestimate the power of walking away with dignity. It is one of the most beautiful forms of truth. To leave without hatred, to leave without begging, to leave without dragging your soul through more humiliation. That is a kind of nobility this world rarely honors in the moment, but always remembers later. Because the people who once had access to your best self know exactly what they lost when they saw you depart, with your head held high. They know that a kind heart can become a closed door. They know that a patient spirit can become an immovable boundary. They know that a soul that has finally awakened is no longer easy to wound in the same way. That is why your exit becomes unforgettable. It is not loud, but it is absolute. It does not scream, but it shakes the ground. There is also a darker truth, ladies and gentlemen, one that the ego resists, but the soul knows very well. Some people only begin to value what they have ruined, not because they become better, but because absence is a brutal teacher. Their regret does not always mean transformation. Sometimes it simply means loss has become real. They cannot go back and rewrite the story. They cannot erase the neglect. They cannot restore the innocence they destroyed. They can only carry the memory. And memory, when mixed with regret, is a heavy burden. You became that burden because you were real. You became that burden because you mattered. You became that burden because truth has a way of surviving long after convenience dies. And what does this mean for you? It means you must never confuse being unforgettable with being unworthy. You are unforgettable because your heart mattered. You are unforgettable because your light was not common. You are unforgettable because you gave something genuine in a world filled with performance. Your lesson was never about your inadequacy. It was about their awakening, and if they did not awaken in time, that is not your failure, that is their tragedy. Your task now is not to remain the wound. Your task is to become the wisdom that the wound revealed. Your task is to build a life so rooted in self-respect that no one can ever reduce you to a lesson of neglect again. Ladies and gentlemen, the highest stage of suffering is not despair, it is consciousness. It is when pain becomes knowledge. It is when disappointment becomes discernment. It is when the abandoned self returns not as a victim, but as a sovereign presence. This is the transformation the soul secretly desires. Not to be broken forever, but to be broken open enough to see clearly. And once you see clearly, you can never fully return to the old blindness. You can love again, yes. You can trust again, yes. You can open your heart again, yes, but never in the same naive way, never at the expense of your dignity, never in a way that makes your soul invisible to yourself. There is a sacred grief in becoming wiser than the people who harmed you. It is sacred because it costs you innocence, it costs you ease, it costs you illusions, but it gives you something far more valuable, self-possession. And self-possession is the quiet throne of the healed soul. It means no one else gets to define your value. No one else gets to decide your reality. No one else gets to tell you that your pain was small when it was great, or that your love was ordinary when it was rare. You know what you gave. You know what you endured. You know what you survived. And because you know, you no longer need their agreement to validate the truth. You became a lesson they can never forget, because lessons like this are written in the deepest part of memory. They are not the kind that fade quickly. They are the kind that return in moments of silence, in moments of comparison, in moments when a new presence does not quite match the old one, when a new conversation feels emptier, when a new bond feels less alive. Then the mind compares. Then the soul remembers. Then the heart realizes that some people were never ordinary at all. They were miracles in disguise, and they were treated like disposable things. That realization can come too late to repair the past, but not too late to change the future, and perhaps that is the hidden mercy in all of this. What was lost becomes the reason you never settle again. Ladies and gentlemen, the strongest people are not those who never bleed. The strongest people are those who learn how to turn their bleeding into understanding. They learn how to turn heartbreak into boundaries. They learn how to turn rejection into refinement. They learn how to turn humiliation into wisdom. They learn how to turn longing into discernment. They learn that the goal is not to become cold. The goal is to become clear. The goal is not to build walls around the soul. The goal is to build a self so honest, so whole, so grounded, that no deception can easily live there again. That is not bitterness. That is maturity. And let me tell you something else, ladies and gentlemen. The people who once made you feel small often do not realize they were standing at the edge of something sacred. They did not know they were handling someone whose future would outgrow their imagination. They did not know that the person they overlooked would become the very proof of their mistake. They did not know that your silence would one day speak louder than their noise. They did not know that your healing would become your testimony. They did not know that your dignity would outlive their indifference, but life knows, the soul knows, and history, in its quiet way, knows who was truly significant. So when the memory returns, do not use it only to ache. Use it to remember what you learned. Use it to remember that your time, your love, your attention, and your tenderness are precious. Use it to remember that you no longer need to audition for a place in someone's life. Use it to remember that the right people do not make you feel like a burden for being human. Use it to remember that being chosen by someone incapable of cherishing you is not a blessing. Use it to remember that your self-worth is not negotiable. Use it to remember that your soul deserves what is reciprocal, not what is convenient. Use it to remember that you have already paid enough for the wisdom you carry now. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a final truth I want to place in your hands. Not everyone who loses you understands the magnitude of that loss immediately. Some only understand it when the years pass. Some understand it the moment you are no longer available. Some understand it when they see your strength from a distance. Some understand it in dreams, in loneliness, in the bitter taste of comparison. But whether they understand it quickly or slowly, one thing is certain: the lesson remains. You became a lesson they can never forget because your life carried a truth too powerful to ignore forever. You taught them, through your absence, through your silence, through your departure, that love must be honored while it is present. You taught them that the human heart is not a machine to be used and set aside. You taught them that the soul remembers, and once the soul remembers, nothing is ever the same again. So rise, ladies and gentlemen. Rise with your pain transformed into purpose. Rise with your dignity intact. Rise with your wounds turned into wisdom. Rise with the calm authority of someone who has survived emotional winter and still knows how to bloom. Rise without begging to be understood by those who were determined not to understand. Rise without shrinking to fit the smallness of someone else's love. Rise as the lesson, yes, but also as the liberation. Rise as the memory they cannot shake. But more importantly, rise as the person you were always meant to become after the storm. Because the final victory is not that they remember you. The final victory is that you remembered yourself. And once a person remembers themselves, once they recover their soul from the ruins, once they reclaim their worth from the hands of neglect, they are never truly lost again. They walk differently, they love differently, they choose differently, they live differently, they become a living answer to everything that tried to diminish them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why some people never forget you. Not because you begged to be unforgettable, but because you became the truth they were forced to carry forever. You became a lesson they can never forget. And now, at last, you are becoming the life they can no longer define.